I'm Sandy Hallam, President Emeritus of the Kent Historical Society. Today is Wednesday, July the 26th, 2017, and I am interviewing Tom Roehl, former owner of the Puffer Belly Limited restaurant housed in the Kent Historical Society's 1875 historic Erie Depot. Tom, first of all, would you tell us a little bit about what was your background that got you into this particular partnership with the Historical Society?
Well, my background, education-wise, was not restaurants. When I graduated from college, I graduated in 1959 with a Bachelor of Science degree in geology. And I had learned that what I thought would be a good position in geology required at least a master's, if not a doctor's degree at that period of time. So I went home, I got rid of my military commitment, 6 years in the Army Reserves, and I hired with Stouffer Restaurant Corporation. I began with them as a trainee, went through a very rigorous and admirable Stouffer's did a terrific job on training their management people. And then I went through restaurant assignments in New York City, in Cleveland. I was assistant manager, the executive level, became a restaurant manager, district manager, regional manager in Chicago, and in 1973 came back to Cleveland as the Director of Operations of Stouffer Restaurants. That was, the company at that time was $50+ million company. Wow. And we had a lot of restaurants around. The unique thing about Stouffer's was that the restaurants were primarily individually designed, and many of them started to adopt individual names. Oh. And then I became the division manager, and in trying to analyze what the heck was going on in Stouffer restaurants, it seemed to me that this was a period when Stouffer Frozen Foods, which originally was an outgrowth of the Shaker Square restaurant in the lobby. We had put in a frozen food cabinet and would sell it to local residents for take-home. And widely popular, and there was nothing clever about it. We saw this as a real potential for a business. And so there were people in the company that were assigned that, and ultimately they established the Stouffer Frozen Food Plant on Woodland Avenue in Cleveland, and went on to an obvious huge career there. I don't want to get lost in that in my career, but it was ultimately when Vernon Stouffer died, and I had a personal relationship with Mr. Stouffer. He was a resident in Winton Place, which is the home of Pier W. Pier W is a Cleveland restaurant, a unique Cleveland restaurant. And I was the opening manager there, and I was a manager there for the first 3 years of its existence. And I came to admire Vernon Stouffer, but I also recognized some of his shortcomings. And when he died, he was not confident of his son's ability to take the company forward. And so Vernon sold the company. And he sold it almost secretively to Litton Industries, which was a West Coast conglomerate. And that was a very down day for most of the company, because while they had frozen food in their eyesight to develop with their microwave ovens, they seemed to know nothing about food service. And so there was a difficult period of time there, and I hung in there through that is the time when I became the general manager of Stouffer Restaurants. And that was going along, and we had finally convinced Lytton that we were not interested in some of the plans they had, that we wanted to be independent again. And they verbally agreed that we could go back onto the public market and relist as a private stock. The night before, after we'd done all the due diligence, he called Jim Bigger, who was Vernon Stouffer's son-in-law, and then our corporate exec, and my boss for the last 7 years I was with the company. Called him to New York City and introduced us to our new parent, Nestle. So while that was another shock to the management of Stouffer's and me and our team, it was a great improvement over that period with Lytton. But Nestle is a very focused, benevolent company. They had focused on expanding frozen food. They were only passively interested in restaurants and hotels, and by that time we had a large hotel division, and so they began the process to divest them. And
So if I can move you along a little bit,
I'm sorry,
when
I'm
did
spending
you
too much
get,
time here.
when did you decide you needed to get into your own restaurant?
Okay, the next day.
Good timing.
The
What
next
year?
day.
What
So-
year was that then?
Well, and so my career with Stouffer's, while there, I had had a phone call from the gentleman that had purchased the depot in Berea, Ohio.
Yes.
And through a personal acquaintance, I knew Frank Lovell, one of these guys. And he and his brother wanted me to come over while I was still with Stouffer's to anticipate putting a Stouffer restaurant in their property. And so I called my acquaintance in the development department, George Lewis, and said, George, it might be something you ought to take a look at here. So we went over, we looked at it. George drew up some quick plans. George is very talented as an architect, vision and spirit to change things. And he drew a restaurant, and it wasn't big enough. It was just a small depot. So I responded to the owners that we're not going to proceed, but I said, will you give me an opportunity to consider this personally? And so they said, sure. Then George designed an expansion under the platform roof, which increased the seating, and that helped me create the financial strategy to develop as a restaurant. But I had not left Stouffer's at that point. And so the landlord hired George to do this project, and I was not involved in it beyond that point. They opened that restaurant, and George opened that with the people that he accumulated in 1980, I believe. Some of these dates might bear a little
Yeah,
research.
it might have been a little earlier because we went up a little earlier, I think. It might have been 79, but,
Okay, well, they could have been working at, yeah.
right.
So anyway, in early '81, George called me and said, Tom, I've got some problems. George is a good architect, but he would tell you he didn't have a restaurant management background. By the way, I can barely cook water. I am not a chef or a talented food person. What I was a good manager of people and organization and strategies and things like that. And so he convinced me to leave Stouffer's and buy half of his investment in that company, which is a very modest sum. So I did.
And it
Rude
was
awakening,
called, and what was it called? That was called?
It was called the Puffer Belly.
That's what I thought. That was
Yes.
the first.
It was. And he and I had discussed that name, and I had moved beyond that name. I thought, I'm not sure about that. But you know, on restaurant names, if you have a good restaurant, you can call it whatever you want, and people will associate that in a positive way.
Yes.
If you have a real cute name and you do a poor job of food and beverage, you can call it whatever you want. It's not going to help it. But so I left Stouffer's, I got involved, and we got that thing squared away pretty quick, and were able to take an initial loss to a profit stream that 1981, and we were basically off on our path. I had never left Stouffer's to join George with the intent of just one restaurant. And I thought, well, this is a unique way to what's the word, Doug?
Well, it's reconfigure.
Reconfigure these historic properties. And railroad stations have a very nostalgic draw. People have fond memories of them. Families leaving, families coming, whatever, it's a central activity. And in their age, they were central before it started to become the wrong side of the tracks in later years. I may need help getting
Well,
back on
all
track
right,
here.
let me say this. When we made the contact, and I actually was the one in charge of looking for a preservationist architect, and we looked at a couple in Akron, husband and wife team, and they weren't very interested or knew how to do this. And then I heard about Bob Gady. And we worked with Bob Gady for several years, looking
wonderful
and
man. Yes.
drawing many different drawings. And then we went through several people who never followed through, fell apart. And then he said, there's a guy in my next door office or whatever it was. I thought it was the guy at Stouffer's, that was George Lewis, or it was you. And he said,
Well, they were in the
these
arcade.
guys want a restaurant and they have one in a depot. Why don't you? So it seemed to me that he was pretty much the marriage broker.
Yes, I would agree that, and we regarded him that same way. Bob was a partner financial contributor, because all of our restaurants, when we did 4 properties, were limited partnerships. And I did jot down some details on the Kent one for your interest here. We had no money. We weren't destitute, but I had 4 children who were high school, sophomore, junior, you know, I mean, they all wanted to go to college, and so, you know, money was just as hard to come by then as it is now, I think. So partnerships were an effective way. I'm not sure the best way, but they were an effective way to get into business and be able to get some revenue stream. And
There were a lot of great tax breaks at that time.
Yes,
It was really
correct.
it was the thing that was happening.
And they were very helpful to us. We came to Kent and we met Howard Boyle. John Flynn did attorney work for us. These are both still close friends from my end. I haven't seen them in a long time. I hope they still would have a positive. Pete Williams, and other local people we had conversations with, and we started to get really excited about the thought of restoring the building and putting a restaurant in the town. The building was, and you have photos here that barely tell the story. The penetration, or the windows, had all been blocked, and I think many of them were bricked. I don't think they were necessarily just boards put up. The inside was ravaged. pigeons, other wildlife. I think there was a theater attempt there.
There were
At one
several
point.
performances.
So there were remnants of that, but it was, you needed a real imagination to see something working there. George Lewis was excellent for that. George, in his imagination, could see how it would lay out, and it laid out well for a restaurant. It was large enough. I
And
was
Bob
looking,
had already done the preservation aspect of the outside for us. We already had some
yes,
drawings.
and
That
some
was
of
already-
those expensive things were already being addressed. And I believe you had put a new roof on part of it.
Mhm.
And I believe it was the platform roof, but the tower roofs had not been done yet. Could be other way around, but it's incidental. So anyway, the first thing that George designed was to open the windows. And it was like somebody turned the lights on. When we finally, broke out the windows and put that in, then you could really see, and we really got excited about what this could really be. When I say we, I did do some work, but primarily George did a lot of actual labor down there, and I don't recall, and I don't have good contact with George anymore, but I believe there was a contractor that we had for some carpentry and
I
things
think
like that.
Christensen Construction did do some work on that, and he had
That
done
could
a lot.
be.
He did
Sandy,
some good work.
I'm sorry, I just don't.
Oh, that's all right.
But we finally opened the restaurant in,
And you determined it would be Puffer Belly,
well,
it would be part of this chain that
yes.
you were sort
Well,
of making.
We never really liked to use the word chain,
Yeah,
but we recognized that it was a railroad depot.
yeah.
And we had convinced ourselves that the word puffer belly, while a clumsy and awkward word for a restaurant, was working well in Berea. And because we were doing a good job of food and beverage and service there, it was gaining a nice reputation locally. And so build on that confidence, and there is some exchange between the markets of Kent and Berea, primarily through the university. Families bringing kids down or something, and they start to recognize the name. So we weren't basing our decisions on wanting to build a chain.
Right.
We were trying to take advantage of a unique name that started to have some awareness in the market area. So we decided this to be the Puffer Belly.
And I might add that the Board of Trustees, we all went up and ate in Berea at the restaurant.
I think I remember that.
Yes,
Sure.
it was very important to
Yes,
see
well, of course.
what you did, and
Well,
it was
I-
wonderful.
Doug, we were talking at lunch. A restaurant's reputation is really based on the food and the service, and the name sort of carries with it. And so that's what we were hoping for here. What else can I tell you about the development of it?
Where
we were-
did you, people are always curious about how it was in the interior, all of the things that were gathered up from the,
Yes.
and carriage and all of that, that was different than Berea, and it was quite unique.
Well, the similarity between the two was the ceiling height. And that is a dramatic and significant change between those restaurants, Puffer Belly restaurants, and a lot of restaurants you go in. Because usually they're in a more conventional building with a more typical ceiling height. Even these ceilings are higher than normal, but I think they're 16 or 18 feet. down in the depot here. And so that lent us to try and bring the scale of that down, and that's why we were excited to get the Van Sweringen Surrey that we put up there. And if that wasn't an exercise, we should have, unfortunately, Sandy, we were too excited about what we were doing to stand back and be taking pictures of it.
Right.
But that carriage was probably, and I hope I'm not exaggerating, 4,000 or 5,000 pounds. I mean, it was, could that be?
No,
No, okay.
that's 2 tons you're talking.
Yeah,
That's,
I
I
know
would
they
say,
have-
probably 500-600 pounds.
oh,
No, it's
well,
more
I'm
than that,
sure
I
it's
think.
more than that, Bill, but maybe I am generous, but it was heavy.
Yeah.
It was really heavy. And we used chain falls and come-alongs to, and we'd block it going up, and when we finally put in the links and put it there, we all jumped back because we weren't sure that's gonna stay, but it obviously held it. That was great, and then we were chatting at lunch. Then we go to the local antique shops or flea markets or attics to collect other artifacts. That's where I bought the canoe that we had hanging up in there. And we did have fun. The employees would just love making up stories of that canoe, which had absolutely nothing to do with maybe the Cuyahoga there. They say, oh, an Indian paddled it up from Lake Erie.
But you and George went around and gathered all these? Because I know
Yes.
we didn't do that, the historical, I mean, Bill
Yeah.
may have done.
Well,
Burger.
we had a large collection out of Berea,
Oh,
and anytime we'd see a railroad picture, we'd scarf it up, and many of them were related by industry, but not by Kent.
right.
But then when we came to Kent, we started to get, we'd have some people, we would trade them a meal for a picture. You know, that was, our servers knew, anybody talk about a picture, oh, they'll buy you dinner. Well, it's a good picture, well, they'll buy you 2 dinners. We'd bargain anything for artifacts. And we had some great artifacts there that I believe were sold at auction
Yes.
here. I don't know the results of that activity, as I've lost contact with the people that did that. The painting, a lot of it was professional, a lot of it was by early hired employees and ourselves. We literally put it together on a shoestring. I did make some notes of how I financed it. George and I, as the general partner, we contributed from our treasury $30,000. We then solicited limited partners, and I made up a booklet, a prospectus type of booklet that we passed around to selected people in and around Kent, and or other acquaintances, or a lot of the partners at Berea were excited about that success, and they were bolder than we were almost. Oh yeah, count me in. And we had 16 shares, limited partnerships that netted $160,000. And then I went to the Kent banks, and I was so pleased and proud of what we were doing, and I was so excited about it. And those son of a guns turned me down like, you know, but finally Jack Wertheim, do you remember that name in Kent? He was a...
City? Is that the city?
Yeah, no, he was at Ameritrust.
Oh, America.
Which is, of course, not there anymore. The whole building has changed there. But he agreed, as long as I'd surrender my 4 children and my home and George's children, And we signed on the line. We paid 22.5% interest on that loan. Can you imagine that? You talk about being bold and foolish. And
May I ask you a question? Because the Historical Society was always told a restaurant will never go, a good restaurant, not a drive-through, you know, we didn't have any good restaurants, will never work. People won't go. What was the reason? Was it financial, or did they say to you, a restaurant is a fool's game?
both.
Okay.
Both. Bankers historically, traditionally, are very taffy-pocket in talking with restaurateurs. I mean, you really need to, and certainly not to boast, but I think maybe my career background lent a little sense of credibility that we knew what we were doing financially. And they literally took a risk on us. We paid that loan off early. And that was the proudest day when I could go in and say, you know, here you son of a guns. But it was to the people that had, you know, had confidence in us and agreed to do it. So that was good.
May I ask then, you said you had 160,000 through the partnerships,
Yes.
30,000 that you, and now what?
And $85,000 we borrowed from the bank.
That's what I wanted to ask,
Okay.
because we're trying to think about how much this costs.
So the total investment was essentially $275,000. Now, it should be noted that I rushed that to be open as fast as possible.
I know.
Because in downtime, once you get an employee hired or your equipment in place and things like that, it's essential that you move forward fast. And we did, and fortunately we were able to execute what we were doing well enough that it took hold. And people started to come back or spread the word. And the Kent restaurant was almost immediately profitable. And at the end of 35 years, well actually it was the end of 25 years when I closed the partnership.
Yes.
Because we were contemplating the sale. The investors had like a 435% profit. So they were, well, no, contributing to that, and with late appreciation to the Historical Society, one of the major things that helped us was the rental agreement.
Yes.
And I always admired that the Historical Society was wise enough to recognize the need to keep this going and to give it an impetus for the future by getting a good start and having that rent. The rent was 0.5%, and that's extraordinary. Typically, and I believe in later years we advanced that
Yes.
with some other courtesies, but in accord with the rent, with the lease, typically rent should be 5 or 6%. And today I know that in the marketplace they're even above that. And I accuse greedy landlords for the failure of many restaurants in the industry, not Kent necessarily, but in the US of A, I mean everywhere.
And
Some landlords just think, you know, oh, they're busy, they can pay more. And in fact, they ultimately find out they really can't.
And if I can remind you, because I was on the board,
Yes.
there was a period of time after you were open a while, but Kent's downtown was having a lot of rocky problems. And you came to the board and asked, at that time after it had gone up, the percentage had gone up, and we made a deal to reduce
Yes,
the
you did.
percentage.
Yes, you did.
And it was, I thought, a very wise decision.
Well, Sandy, it was, and it wasn't ever unappreciated. uh, and it was a savior,
Yeah.
really, of it. And, you know, restaurants, no matter how good they think they are, or we thought we were, restaurants typically will have an experience factor or a popularity. And there will be the good times, but there will also be the weak times. And I'm not sure that it is what it is. Oftentimes, it's a change of personnel in the restaurant, or a change of staff, leadership, or something that it's a glitch in the program. And that's the role I was trying to play as we had more restaurants, is to constantly be there and try and spot those soon enough that I could do whatever I had to do to try and get us back on track, with no reference to timing or how long that takes. And it's frustrating that that's why when you're in a restaurant and your server comes by and says, "How was your meal?" and you can barely get through and you haven't enjoyed it. You say, "Oh, everything's fine." It's a stake of death. You know, I mean, if a restaurateur is so dumb he can't see the food coming back to the kitchen, or the guest signals, many of them silent, but there's easy to pick up messages in a restaurant of happiness or disappointment. And I was always trying to teach the management staffs, you've got to react to that. And if you find a disappointed guest in the restaurant, fix it right now. You know, you make some gesture, whether it's a personal apology, or it's a complimented dessert or meal or a cocktail or whatever it is. The cost is less than trying to get another customer in the door. And so philosophically, that's the way I approached it. How effective I was in training and teaching the staff to do this is another question. But I think, you know, I added up this morning, we had 105 operating years of Puffer Belly restaurants, because they were all 4 separate restaurants. So I feel pretty good about that. They all
Were the
were
menus similar, or were they,
well,
did Kent have a specific menu that was working well for us that you kept?
there was a similarity to start, certainly
Okay.
to when we opened
Yes.
Kent. I think we used the same menu as
Yeah, you
Bowie.
did.
We put graphics on it that pertain to town, but we had, I used a dietitian from Stouffer's, a wonderful woman and a very close friend over the years. I had made her a vice president of Stouffer's, so she thought I was okay. And I had her name was Jean Krisman, and Jean helped us write the menus. And so the menus were, certainly there was a pasta and a poultry and a steak or beef item on there, but usually they were unique. They weren't fried chicken. It would be a chicken's jubilee with a cherry sauce, or, you know, something on them that enhanced them a little bit, didn't necessarily increase the price cost-wise to us, but it's a little separation from the competition. So the menus had that, and then each restaurant would always have a chalkboard for daily specials. And they weren't just items from the menu done, but they were all over the map of good, tasty dishes. And that was the responsibility of our kitchen manager or chef. And I might divert a little bit right here, that my experience at Stouffer's and what I gained from Vernon Stouffer and that company, we employed no chefs. All the menus in Stouffer's were written in a home office dietary kitchen, tested there, approved, and then the recipes were clearly written down on cards and shipped to the restaurants where that item would be used. And the dietitian in the restaurant, which should be food trained, primarily women at that time, they would buy the ingredients and they'd make all those items from scratch in the restaurant every day. And it was and the menu was printed uniquely, a daily changing menu in the Cleveland offices, and we'd ship it out to the restaurants. And at that time, we probably had 40 restaurants operating with that kind of a system. And it's an amazing process. I tell people about that today, and unless they were close to it or involved in it, they think I'm lying. How could you do that? You know, just the logistics of it were awkward, expensive compared to what it would cost today, but that's what we did. So with Puffer Belly, we developed a recipe file. And I followed that same general procedure. So we didn't have chefs in our restaurants, but we had a kitchen manager who probably regarded himself as a chef, and that's fine. And we paid him handsomely for what he was doing, but they would follow recipes. And consistency in a restaurant is basic. You've just got to be consistent. And so the way you do that is you're consistent in the food directions that you buy, the raw product, how you prepare it, how you plate it, how you serve it. And so that's doable,
Let me ask,
not common.
let me ask about the particular relationship between the success of the restaurant and having Kent State University here, because we didn't have a lot of downtown businesses or anything, in both the success of who was coming to the restaurant and who you hired in terms of, I assume, because I know many students who work there. How did that relationship work?
Good for you, Sandy. You're keeping me on track. Not real significant at the start.
At the start, right.
In fact, Braze Golding, remember that name?
Yes.
And his predecessor, and I can't remember who was.
Glenn Olds.
Pardon?
Glenn Olds.
Glenn Olds.
Or
Maybe.
it might have been briefly Michael Schwartz.
It was Michael Schwartz.
And he was very briefly, and then he came back and was president again.
Yes.
It was
Okay.
during the,
Not Mr. Golding, but Mr. Schwartz, and I followed him in his career down
To
to
Cleveland.
Cleveland State, yeah, and Braze Golding. And I approached them for a partnership share, bold as we were, and that didn't fly. But at that time, we had very little student awareness or market down there.
right?
Now, the Puffer Belly financials used to serve probably 85% food and 15% beer, wine, or liquor.
Oh,
We were clearly a restaurant before we were a bar. And I preferred that, and we managed that. If we saw our liquor sales getting too high, we would try to do something to change that, to boost our food or to minimize the liquor, because we did not. Charlie Thomas is a good friend, and I admire his business, but yet I didn't want that beer business and all the associated problems with it. And I always thought it would be disruptive to a diner who came in for a nice meal. I've had a nice meal at Charlie's over at Ray's, as best I can remember. If Charlie ever sees this, I apologize. But it is, they do a great job of what they do. And our focus was to do something different. We wanted to be a regular restaurant. I forget the name of the place out, the steakhouse out at Twin Lakes.
Rusty Nail? The Rusty
The
Nail?
Rusty Nail.
Or the Twin Lakes
Of course.
Tavern? You know,
No,
Rusty
well,
Nail.
I'm thinking primarily Rusty Nail at that time. In fact, I think the tavern may have been closed and reopened
You're right.
back in that era. But we wanted to be different from the Rusty Nail in our menu selection. And we thought we could improve in service. We knew that we couldn't compete necessarily as the favored old spot, because it clearly was, and it was very successful at that time. And I have no idea what goes on out there now, whether there's still...
Well, it's closed now.
Okay.
There's a new restaurant that just reopened.
Okay. But you know, you look at your competition and you try to understand why you're different from them and why you are a better choice for the market you're aiming at.
Right.
So Kent State was the main population in town, but yet we started to get people from the community, and I think if we did get faculty and staff, I think we got a lot of them. We got a lot of parents when they'd be down for weekend or visitation or things like that, or bringing kids down, or some would say, oh, I had to bring the laundry down, so we came over for... but we did not necessarily market to the students. Now, that did change over the years, and one of those fluctuations in sales volumes. Then we started to more specifically reach out and really try to fill the voids with new customers. But our opinion was that at that era, the college students really didn't have the spare money to do what we were trying to do. They always enjoyed the meal if someone else was going to pay for it.
You had a very strong lunch, and...
Lunch was terrific.
And that seemed to be a lot of steady
Well,
repeat.
you know,
people.
in that, a lot of our hopes, lunch wasn't as good as we would have liked. And I think that speaks to the lack of downtown
Mhm.
in, development here. Our lunch market drove to the restaurant. We hoped that they would walk to the restaurant. They'd be close enough that they could walk to the restaurant. And as it evolved, and you certainly know better than I, the timeline of development of downtown Kent, that it just didn't happen. And we kept hoping, kept trying to do different things, different marketing ideas, but I think the support of Kent State today is real important, and it's so much more apparent how it can happen. So,
And
however
the
they
downtown,
market
and
it.
you've got that
Sure.
locus of downtown people working, coming.
Yeah.
There's so many
Right,
opportunities to
synergistic,
grab them.
yeah, you know,
I
it'll build
think-
on each other.
I think Doug Fuller's here, and he wanted to ask a question.
Tom, I just wanted to take you back to the very beginning again. The Berea restaurant you had was kind of set away from the downtown, if I remember right. It wasn't coupled right in the downtown. The depot here at Kent, obviously, is right in the middle
Right.
of the downtown. And you've already described the physical condition of the building, the depot, when you got here. Can you talk a little bit about what you saw in the town? Because it, in those days, wasn't the vibrant downtown that it is now. And how you saw that and was willing to, again, come in as an entrepreneur.
In spite
and
of
take a risk.
what may have been.
Well, we were making these considerations at the onset. And so we were filled with hope because we did hear of the promises or the hopes for the development. And all too much hope was based on the hotel forever, and probably still possibly, I don't know. But what ultimately happened was the corridor tie-in and the investment of university-directed businesses. We passed some clothing stores. There was no clothing store for jackets or anything like that for the kids from the university when we opened there. There was, I don't know, there was a livery stable down there. I mean, there were just,
It was a pretty
there was a
dark,
barrel.
if I
It
can
was a
jog
pretty-
your memory, it was the city manager who was newly here when we started
Yeah.
that put the lights on Franklin Avenue. It was a dark and scary street.
Well, let me tell you, we talk about the depot. Franklin Avenue was an embarrassment that it was called an avenue. As far as I was concerned, I couldn't imagine. I said, who are we kidding? And so we had our oar in the water to try and motivate and help that. And in fact, we did significantly because Pufferbelly's vote was 1/2 of the tax support for that, because we control the entire west side of the street, where we paid the taxes for that, ultimately.
I think you should make that clear that you also, under the partnership, had a triple net lease.
Yes,
And that was also a big chunk for you to take on.
absolutely, absolutely. But, you know, we were willing to do so because part of that whole equation was the rent consideration that we were enjoying. And so we were willing to pay the taxes to pour it into the street. And we got the curbs, we got the restoration of the brick surface, we got the lamp poles, we got the wiring underground where, I mean, it was, I see some of those old pictures and it's just a cobweb of wires, and some of them were electrical, some of them were phone and utility, some of them were probably string to hold up banners from some activity, from anything. Greatly improved that area. And the city putting the gazebo down there, huge in environment. My comment to Doug today and down there is the trees almost obliterate the north end of and we were concerned about that years ago. The trees now finally are getting taller and you can almost see the sign that's there. And I don't know how the new user of the building will do his signage, but he may not be concerned about that and just take down the old sign that's on the end and put one that everybody can see.
Oh, so you put that sign there because there wouldn't have been any other place lower that would have, I mean, the signs on that top were...
Well, who knows, Sandy? The sign at Berea is on the end of our building there, and it's the same shape and the same idea, and it has no foliage or tree forward of it, and it worked.
So-
We were bold, not necessarily smart. You know, and we thought, well, put that sign, okay, here, we got a sign. And Puffer Belly Limited is a long, awkward name for a sign painter, not wanting to hyphenate it. And so it was a good decision as far as we're concerned.
Put
And
it
then
on.
there was no tree. So
You didn't
We
necessarily
laugh
have
a
a
lot.
lot of difficulty putting in the tremendous improvements, working with the city of Kent in terms of all the permits. You said it went very quickly. I'm assuming they were pretty helpful because they wanted it to go in.
I think that's true. Do you remember Orphanage? Orphanage was a bar on Main Street, and we bought that. we had some difficulties with our
Oh, the
liquor
license.
license. So we bought Orphan Annie's liquor license. Well, you don't just buy a liquor license. The law is that you buy the furniture, fixtures, and equipment, basically. So they had a piano that had somewhere at least 80 keys. They had a couple of folding chairs, the license, and the back bar.
Oh,
And the bar, now, I didn't look that closely. I think they took it out.
yes, they did.
But the bar that we had for 35 years was the old Orphan Annie bar, somewhat modified and reworked with a hammer and a saw. And the back bar were those, remember the glass things with the lights behind it? Oh my God.
And that came from that restaurant?
Yes, yeah.
Wow.
We used that. So that, you know, the bar had failed, or the ownership was abandoning it or whatever. So it was not particularly expensive, and we carried it all as a liquor license asset. And we bought anything we got out of that. Sans piano was a hit. The piano, I think, was ceremoniously damaged with a hammer.
Let me ask
What
a
fun.
very funny question in retrospect, and perhaps David Dix would also like to venture a question on. If you had, having been through this, knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently starting then? Was there anything that I think you did it very well. I'm
Yeah.
just wondering, in retrospect, if there's anything.
Sandy, that's tough to answer. I don't have any glaring thing. In anything, I would say I wouldn't want to offend the memory of Bill Berkner or
Right.
any of the people that were so instrumental in helping us. I think if we were a little more strongly financed, we might have done some things that we didn't do because of a concern for finances. We certainly, at a later time, developed a cash flow that we could do things. And those that we didn't move ahead with or do would be a lack of focus on my part, or we just, were busy with our next restaurant or things like that. But I think that from the community we got, and from the Historical Society, we did get the support that we needed to get off and running.
Well,
And then once you get the door open, then it's up to the operator. You just have to do the job to earn the business to continue.
Well, I know Bob Gady was incredibly pleased that the building was historically
Yeah.
great on the outside,
Yeah.
which is what the registry, the building is on the
Right,
National
right.
Historic Register. And he was pleased, we got both parts,
Yeah.
the outside and the inside.
Yeah, well, Bob was a good friend, he's a great guy, and we remained in communication with him. In fact, Bob, he became an investor in our Erie project, which was a nice note of support for us that he would
Yeah.
carry that on. And the Erie project operated 30, excuse me, all I gotta say is it's helped me grow old. I thought I had a minute.
Are you completely now retired and divested
Oh,
from
my word,
anything?
yes.
Yes,
Yes, I
and
am.
aren't you pleased?
50 years
Well, 50 years of
in the
restaurant.
business, constant. Yes, I'm glad, and so is my family. My wife, I've reacquainted myself with her, and that's worked out well. And yeah, we're very happy.
Well, did you, David, have anything that was curious
Did you
to
get any
you?
out-of-town trade, people that came, that hear about you from Cleveland or Akron and come over, you know, how much out-of-town trade you brought into town?
We never had an accurate way to measure that, but yet I think it was a significant help to us. Seeing more and more as we were there longer.
Mhm.
And that also helped us at Hornblowers years later. We opened Hornblowers in 1992. And we had opened here in 1981, so
Right.
11 years after this. We had done Erie in the interim, but we would get a transfer of customers. The
You were,
Horn,
you said 35 years, that brings you up to 2016, so you were a partner with Kevin, or had you?
no, I was not a partner with Kevin.
Yeah.
We sold Kevin the assets of the business in 2007. I don't think it's important for this necessarily,
Right.
but he paid us a fair price, but it was not elevated for name or anything like that.
He had worked there, though. He had been
He
an
certainly
employee.
had, and he deserved it, and that was part of an earlier discussion that I had committed to him, that Kevin, when we sell, you will have the first option, and he took that. Actually, I sold the Erie restaurant to the original manager in the same fashion,
Well,
who died of cancer, and when his estranged spouse benefited from that, we were obligated to offer her the opportunity to buy the Erie restaurant, which was painful to me, but I hadn't got the word out of my mouth, and she said, "No way." Their marriage had failed, and it was not a happy situation there. And but Erie operated 31 years.
Right.
And I sold it immediately to Erie Insurance Company,
Oh, there.
which was our neighbor
Smart.
there and our early benefactor in helping us introduce to Erie. And they had subsequently completely surrounded our restaurant with their development of their offices. And so they were anxious to control the destiny of the building, and they removed all vestiges of restaurant.
Oh, And made it-
We had built a building in the back of the firehouse. It was a firehouse, and we had put a authentic to pictorial history in the back for the kitchen. And because they didn't intend to continue to use it for a restaurant or food service of any kind, they removed that, and it's a handsome red brick building right down in the center of downtown Erie.
wow.
But that was a great restaurant, nice reputation, nice record of profitability, and it was fun to merchandise because firefighting is a big deal in Erie. And every summer we'd give trophies and had a big event for water battles. You ever seen firefighters? They'll get their 2 trucks and put up an apparatus, so they stretch a tight wire between them, from which they hang a barrel, a pony keg, and then the 2 teams on each side get their equipment out, and they blow a whistle, and they try and move the barrel to the other end of the line. And of course, they're getting the overspray from the other team, and it is not only hilarious, but it's become very competitive. And but it was fun to market those type of events related to the restaurant. Of course, it'd be a very busy day at the restaurant.
Yeah,
Because
very
people
good.
come down and watch it the whole weekend. So,
Well, let me say, on behalf of someone who's been on the board since 1974, that it was a wonderful day when we made the connection.
Thank you.
And
thank you very much.
I really and truthfully believe that the restoration of the station and the opening of a good restaurant it was a family restaurant.
Right.
It was to bring people downtown as opposed to some of the other bar-oriented
Yeah.
restaurants,
Yeah.
was exactly what would help at least give people faith that the town could grow.
Yeah.
And I think it was phase one for me of development in Kent. And
Well,
I'm grateful to you and grateful that you were so knowledgeable, because now that I know your background, it was the difference between the people we interviewed who had a dream
Yeah.
and the people who really knew what they were doing.
well, certainly I share the credit with my partner, George,
George was wonderful.
who knows Kent as he was a student here.
Oh, he went to architecture school.
I believe he got his degree here. He's a few years my junior, but he brought an important part to the whole development. So,
Well, we're very-
thank you.
Thank
very-
you.
You're
You're
very
great.
welcome.
You're great.
Did you have a chance to go into the new restaurant today?
We stepped inside.
You did.
Yeah, they
You
were
can turn
doing
that
some
off.
painting, and I'm impressed that they,
It's a big space now, it's great.
yes, and, removing the elevated bar area
Yes,
and the elevated,
the other part where we
and
ate,
the other part
the dining area.
makes a lot of sense, created a lot of problems, a lot of limitations for us on arrangement of guest seating. But we did it for some crazy reasons. High plumbing, or the floor was in bad shape, or things that if you have the budget, you don't worry about. And if you don't have the budget, you discover a inexpensive solution. And George was very good at that.